Hi there, I'm David Busch. This is presentation 11.3 on the background to the Civil War, specifically on a decade called the Decade of Crisis. So I'm going to go through this with you. This PowerPoint will be available on my website, bushhistory.net. And let's take a look and see what happens during the 1850s that leads us to the Civil War. America has been expanding throughout the early part of the 1800s. We tripled in size since 1800. We increased our population from 5.3 to 23 million. Income rose incredibly, and cotton was the most important product produced in the United States. Harry Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1851 to 1852. Notice 1851 to 1852 because it's serialized. Uncle Tom's Cabin is 1 week at a time over the span of about a year. And very important, most printed and most read book of the 19th century. Up until we get to the latter part of the 1840s, we were compromising again and again on slavery. We had the free states, we have the slave states, and California will enter as a free state as a result of the compromise of 1850. There's a huge debate over states' rights and slavery. Does a state have dominion over the people within its states and its possessions? And that means, is it allowed to have slaves? John C. Calhoun argued that the Constitution allowed the southern states to control slaves, and the Northerners feared the wealth of the South, which they called slave power. Slave power is a term used to describe the aristocrats in the South who controlled the money, the cotton industry, the power, and the slaves. The major arguments between the North and the South were based on their beliefs about expansion, common beliefs. Both the North and the South wanted to expand. Both wanted to go across the country. The question is, what happens when they go across the country? Are the new territories going to be slave or free? The South believed that cotton was so important that the North should leave it alone, and cotton dominated industry in the United States. It was the most valuable export the United States had. The Compromise of 1850. We're starting to have a changing of the guard. John C. Calhoun dies in 1850, and 2 years later, Clay and Webster will be dead as well. This Compromise of 1850 was that California would be a free state, the Mexican possessions would be popular sovereignty, which is the people get the vote, and it's slave territory, so no one cares. We get a very tough fugitive slave law out of it, and the anti-slavery Northern Whigs and pro-slavery Southern Democrats were at least still willing to compromise. We're going to get the Fugitive Slave Act in 1851, and that's going to allow bounty hunters to capture runaway slaves in the North. It's going to be very, very controversial. The election of 1852, we're going to get a guy by the name of Franklin Pierce winning that election in 1852. And you can see he is green, and Winfield Scott was a Whig. He was this kind of a darker color here. Pierce was thought to be a do-nothing, and he pretty much was a do-nothing president. The national party system is failing because we have too many people interested in nominating candidates for presidency. We're going to get Stephen Douglas, who'd like to be president. In 1854, he comes up with the KansasNebraska Act. The KansasNebraska Act is an attempt to allow popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska because he wants to build a railroad. And the guy that builds a railroad is like putting a man on the moon. If you build a railroad in the 1850s, you're connecting the east and west of the United States. Connecting that east and west parts of the United States, that's like putting a man on the moon. So he wanted to be president, and he's trying to build his resume. The KansasNebraska Act, which allowed popular sovereignty in the new territories, nullified the Missouri Compromise because Kansas was right alongside of Missouri, and the Missouri Compromise said no slavery north of Missouri's southern border. And that led to something called Bleeding Kansas. And Bleeding Kansas were people actually fighting and killing each other in Kansas over whether they should be free or slaves. New England Emigrant Aid Society versus the Border Ruffians, the Free Soilers versus the Border Ruffians. There were all kinds of fraudulent elections. Many of these elections, there were more votes cast than there were people actually living there. Kansas became home to burnings and other violence as a result of this KansasNebraska Act. It ended up being a really bad idea. At the same time, you have nativists. Nativists are anti-immigrant, which is really code for anti-Catholic. They didn't like the fact that there were Catholics coming into the United States who they believed had an allegiance to something other than the government of the United States, meaning the Pope. And portrayed very well in The Gangs of New York, a movie about a place called Five Points in New York in the 1850s. There's some reality in it, there's some Hollywood in it, but it shows the level of tension between these different groups. There are new parties coming up. The Whigs turned to this new American Party, which had nativist feelings. They became known as know-nothings. Know-nothings, when they were questioned, would say, I don't know. You'd ask a know-nothing, so what's your party all about, the American Party? You'd say, what's the American Party? I don't know. Because they didn't want it to be associated. They were almost like grandfathers of that Klan kind of secret thinking. At this time, most people who were working in cities had come from small farms, so you had small farmers and city workers dominated. The party split into northern and southern parts in 1855 and would eventually become the Northern and Southern Whigs. And the Republican Party was founded in 1854 with the sole goal of ending slavery. The Republican Party was the abolitionist party, which is why today's Republican Party likes to claim direct lineage to that Republican Party. That Republican Party is not today's Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican from that Republican Party, which is why the modern day Republican Party wants to connect itself with Abraham Lincoln, because who wouldn't? But you have to follow that line along and see there's really great differences between the modern Republican Party that we have today and the Republican Party that was born in 1854. The Republican Party in 1856, they're going to try and get their candidate elected president. It's not going to happen. John Fremont is going to be one of their candidates, is going to be their candidate. John Fremont's going to be their candidate, but James Buchanan gets the dominant amount of Southern votes, and he becomes the president in 1857. Strangely enough, a little codicil about that. The Supreme Court had actually decided in 1856 about Dred Scott. Roger Taney was the Chief Justice. He was a friend of James Buchanan. James Buchanan says, Roger, why don't you wait until after the inauguration to announce the Dred Scott decision? And Taney says, okay. Very illegal, by the way. But Buchanan did not want it influencing the election in any way. Although Buchanan won, the Republicans claimed a victorious defeat because now they were known. Now we knew who the Republicans were, and they figured they would put up a stronger candidate in 1860, and oh boy did they. Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857, the idea that a free territory meant a free territory, and that a slave taken into a free territory should be free. It didn't go that way. Dred Scott was taken into Illinois, brought back into slave territory. His master died. His master left Dred Scott to his wife. His wife was not allowed to own property, according to the laws of the day. So Dred Scott ended up under John Sanford's control, who was the brother of the widow, whose name simply escapes me right now, who had Dred Scott. So John Sanford was an abolitionist from New York, which is how a black man gets to the Supreme Court in the 1850s, with the help of a white man. John Sanford said, just freeing Dred Scott wanted a national precedent set by the Supreme Court that a slave taken into free territory should be free. He didn't get it. Roger Taney said that a slave can't sue. A slave can't go to the Supreme Court. A slave has no rights. Thereby, I'm not going to decide on this case, which in essence leaves the status quo, leaves Dred Scott as a slave. He was freed by John Sanford, but John Sanford did not get the precedent decision he wanted. The Lecompton Constitution was a pro-slavery constitution in Kansas. It was a reaction to the Topeka Constitution, which is a free constitution in Kansas. The people of Kansas rejected the Lecompton Constitution and accepted ultimately the Topeka Constitution, and Kansas became a free state in 1861. The Panic of 1857, nothing like a good panic to really throw people in uproar. The economy was collapsing. The economy was collapsing. There was more competition from Egyptian cotton in the United States at the time, and because of this, there's greater turmoil in the country. That is exactly the same year as the Dred Scott decision. We're going to get John Brown's raid in 1859 in Harper's Ferry, following other raids, the most notable being in Pottawatomie, Kansas. And we are off on the road to the fuse that's going to lead to the election of 1860. In the election of 1860, you have 4 candidates: Abraham Lincoln, John Breckinridge, John Bell, and Stephen Douglas. If you take a careful look, at the color, this is Abraham Lincoln. These are the electoral votes, not the popular votes. Yes, Lincoln does win the dominant amount of electoral votes, but Abraham Lincoln only wins 39%. That's right, 39% of the popular vote, which means 61% wanted someone else. And it was thought that if the Northern and Southern Democrats had combined, they indeed would have more popular votes than Abraham Lincoln, hopefully getting more electoral votes. So the reality is, the public in 1860 did not want Abraham Lincoln, they wanted someone else. But because Abraham Lincoln was not on the ballot in the southern states, he got no votes down south, and because of a division in the Democratic Party between John Breckinridge and Stephen Douglas, the Democratic Party splits, and by odd configuration of math and the aligning of the stars, just so, Abraham Lincoln, with 39% of the popular vote, will get the dominant amount of electoral votes and become the 16th president of the United States. You can understand why the South seceded. Which led to the establishment of the Confederacy. Confederacy was 7 states that seceded after the election of 1860, starting with South Carolina. The Confederacy firmly believed that they would be an independent nation, and that as an independent nation they would negotiate treaties with the Union and have a good relationship with the Union. However, the Confederacy's major mistake was they lacked a strong central government, because they're a confederation. Confederations, almost by definition, do not have a strong unifying government. And that is going to be their undoing as we go forward. In Lincoln's inauguration, he said, "We are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies." And we could argue all day, and we will, when we take a look at the next topic on the Civil War, is exactly how the beginning of the Civil War occurs. But Lincoln did not seek to cause the war to begin. Here is the election of 1860 with the actual numbers. Abraham Lincoln, popular vote, 1,800,000. Stephen Douglas, 1,300,000. Breckinridge, 800,000. John Bell, 592,000. If you add these popular votes, you will find out that they easily defeat Abraham Lincoln's popular vote total. But because of division between the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats, they divide the vote, and John Bell, who simply wants to keep the nation together, really muddies the waters up. And what we get is we get Abraham Lincoln winning the dominant amount of states in the electoral votes, and he will become the President of the United States. And this is what we're going to look like when the Confederacy secedes. On the right here, we simply have a chart, which frankly is going to be easier to see when you take a look at the PowerPoint on your own off bushhistory.net, but it shows a dominant amount. These blues are all the resources that the North controlled over the South. So the North is in a much better place at the beginning of the Civil War than the South is. So I'm going to leave that here today. I'm going to continue to work on these shadows. I hope they're not interfering too much. Let me know if you have any ideas about lighting here, guys. I could always use a suggestion. So for now, David Busch from Busch History. Check the Busch History website, www.bushhistory.net, and you will find a YouTube folder, and in it, in folder 11, you will see 11.1, 2, and 3, and those deal with the background to the Civil War. So, have a good day. This is David Busch. Take care. Bye.